Dear Barbara, dear Jan, dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to have the chance to give a lecture on climate change issues and low carbon transformation to this kind of distinguished audience, and to have the chance to discuss these issues together. I think that this is one of the most pressing things which we have in front of us. This is why I'm here passionately to talk about this issue. The title of the lecture is The Great Transformation Towards a Global Low-Carbon Economy. And I would like to talk about this issue from a really global perspective, because this is, at the end of the day, the only solution we have to solve the climate issue. When we talk about reducing greenhouse gases, at the end of the day, this implies that we need to go from a high-carbon global economy, this is where we are, to a global low-carbon economy. This is where we need to go. So this is what I want to talk about. We published a book, a report, 4 weeks ago on this title. The summary is already there on the homepage from the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which I'm co-sharing. And we presented it to our government 2 weeks ago and discussed it with our ministers. So this is fresh material, and I hope it will be interesting for your debates too. So let's start. This is what I want to do. I would like to talk about low carbon why. I will do this rapidly because most of you understand very well why we need to look towards a path on low carbon trajectories, because this is the only way to avoid dangerous climate change. Then the next step is low carbon. Is this a mission impossible or mission impossible? This is a huge debate. I think that Copenhagen failed because most decision makers think that low carbon development, reducing globally emissions by 50 to 80% towards 2050, is impossible, a mission impossible. I will try to demonstrate that our data demonstrate that we think it is a mission impossible. It might even be a motor of innovation towards a new type of market economy. The third issue I would like to focus on is, if this is a mission possible, so how? How to do it? And what does it cost? This is always important, because if we go towards a new type of economic organization, which will bring us a new financial crisis, it wouldn't work at all. So it needs to be climate friendly, it needs to be low carbon, but we need to be able to finance it. I will try to show that we can finance that. And then my last point is something like the overarching issue here. Europe is really a strategic, Barbara, no? Europe is really a strategic actor in this field, trying to push the global economy, the European economy first, and then via international cooperation, the global economy also, towards low carbon. I think there is only one other place on Earth where similar things are happening at a similar speed, maybe at a higher speed, and this is China. So I will also talk about China and low carbon development. So this is what I would like to do. No further comment on global warming. You all know the data, you all know the scenarios. We are probably currently on a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius path. We are not on a 2 degrees Celsius path. But I will not go into the details here. I will immediately translate these global warming curve into development issues. There are many impacts of global climate change, but at the center are the following 4 issues from my perspective. Let's have a look on these 4 issues. I call this the 4 fundamentals of global development. 4 fundamentals for industrialized countries, 4 fundamentals for developing countries, for emerging economies. We all need these 4 fundamentals of development for any kind of economic and social progress. So what are we talking about? We are talking first about food and soil. So we all need to eat, very easy. We are then talking about water. We all need water, absolutely basic. We then need for all our economies, we need energy. So it's about energy. Unfortunately, it is about currently high carbon energy. So there is a problem. And then we all need, this is what we have been learning during the last 20 years from climate scientists, we need a certain stability in the climate system, in the atmosphere. So these are the 4 fundamentals. If we don't get these 4 fundamentals right, we can bring our financial stability processes forward, we can invest in innovation, we will run into heavy crises, because this is basic. And without this basics, development on the middle and long term will not work. So I will go through very rapidly these four basic pillars, these four basic dimensions, playing with data of a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius scenario to show where we go if we don't go towards low carbon. Let's start with the climate stability issue. So what is the main point here? I would like to emphasize two main issues here. The first issue is that we calculated the global greenhouse gas budget, which is still available if we really would like to go for 2 degrees Celsius. So, avoiding dangerous climate change. If you calculate that, you are coming up with a certain greenhouse gas budget for the next 40 years towards 2050 and then towards 2100. We calculated this budget, this global budget, with a probability to reach this 2 degrees Celsius target with a probability of 67%, 2/3. Why 2/3? Why not 100%? We all know that climate change might be dangerous. The answer is actually very easy and a bit frustrating also. If you calculate 100% security to really stay within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor, the budget which you get for the global economy is so small, we will not be able to do that. So we calculated 2/3. And then you come up, or we came up with 750 gigatons from now on to 2050. This is the global budget which we need to manage. I will come back to this point how to manage it. To demonstrate that this is a scarce product now, 750 gigatons, if we maintained the level of greenhouse gas emissions from 2010, you have been reading in the newspapers yesterday that we are still growing in terms of emissions. If we maintained it, we would have about this budget would be running out of substance in 20 years' time. In 20 years' time. So we have a scarce product here in front of us. This is the first point. This budget is small. The second point is the time pressure point. Barbara, you have been talking about the time dimensions. This is a very crucial point because many decision makers have the feeling that climate change is a long-term issue. So let's concentrate on the short-term issues. It's about the financial crisis, it's about collapsing firms, etc., etc. This graph shows to you that time pressure is very high. Because what we calculated here is that if we would peak the global emissions in 2011, so today, we would need to come down year per year to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor, year by year, around 3.7% annually. This is still possible. For those of you who are economists, who know labor productivity gains or efficiency gains, these are high targets, but 3.7% is still possible to think about. If we would peak with our global emissions in 2020, we would need to bring our global emissions down annually by 9%. This is economically, institutionally, financially absolutely impossible. And this implies that if we really want to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius target, time pressure is high. We need to peak rapidly. If we don't peak rapidly, dangerous climate change going beyond 2 degrees is absolutely unavoidable. This would imply that we need to invest much more than in adaptation and damage investments, to say so. So the time pressure is very, very high. This is the first dimension. The budget is scarce and small, and time pressure is very high. The second issue, the second fundamental of any global development is water. So this is the global water map from 2007, the current global water map. Everything what is blue is nice and fine, water enough. Everything what is red is difficult, physical water problems. Relatively little people live there. Or the other way around, because there is little water, relatively few people are living there, obviously. And then we do have sub-Saharan Africa here in brown or yellow or something. This is not physical water scarcity. It's not. It is what we as economists or development economists call socio-economic water scarcity. So water is there, but infrastructure is lacking. People can't buy the water, can't pay the water. These are issues which we theoretically could solve. Infrastructure, investments, economic development. So water is there also in sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has actually a fantastic potential for agricultural production, much higher than today. Very important for a world which is growing from 6.7 billion people to 9 billion people in 2050. Africa could help to feed the world. So this is then the world on the way to a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius global warming process until the end of the century. What we are seeing here is the water map from 2040, 2070, in 3, 4, 5 decades from now. And what you see is that we will have physical water problems not only on the local levels, but on continental levels. We see that here in Africa, we see it also in Latin America, Australia, we see it also in parts of India. India is an important case here, so physical water problems. I'm actually coming back from New York. I have been in New York during the last days. The Security Council, we had a discussion with the Security Council people about this kind of data, because the Security Council is reflecting on bringing climate as a security issue in a routinized way into its agenda. Because this is about migration. This is about people need to move. And they need to look for different places where to live. So this is migration pressure. And this is a security issue, therefore. So water. Water is absolutely key. Let's go to the third element. I've been talking about the climate stability. I've been talking about water. This is food and soil. So 2 different dimensions are important here. 2 different dynamics which are linked to global warming. The first dimension is droughts. The first dimension is processes of droughts by global warming and higher temperatures. And you see here in red the areas where we will see fundamental droughts. And in these areas, with the technologies, the agricultural ones which we have now, agricultural production will be difficult or impossible for a world which is growing in population. So this is droughts. We do have a second phenomena which is different. It is about soil degradation. Soil degradation is not about too little water. It's not about droughts. Soil degradation is the following phenomenon. Here you see a map of China, and in the northwestern part, regional warming will be much stronger than in the coastal areas. So heat waves. Heat waves in the northwestern part of China. We are going to see this phenomena in many regions around the world. India is a case, Sub-Saharan Africa is a case. And now what is happening is that these kind of heat waves and warming is coupled with very strong rainfalls. So it's not about too little water, it's too much water in not the right moment to say so. So you have heatings. You have the phenomenon of soil which is very, very strongly closed, and then the strong waterfalls will drain the agricultural food out, food soil out. So this is about food production and soil degradation. And here are the regions which will be affected by soil degradation. This is very important, about China, and it is about India, as you can see. These are the 2 biggest nations on earth in terms of population. So soil degradation will become a very important issue in a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius world. So let's go to the last pillar of the 4 fundamentals of global development. It was about soil and food. It was about water and climate stability, the global greenhouse gas budget, and the time pressure which we have there. The 4th is energy. We all need energy for our economies, for social progress, for economic progress. Unfortunately, the energy system we have is driving climate change. All the problems which we have been seeing before are driven by fossil-based energy systems. Our global energy system is based by more or less 85% on fossil fuels currently, and only 15% by non-fossil fuels. What you can see here is a calculation of a business-as-usual path developed by the International Energy Organization towards 2100, so more or less the same investments during the next decades which we had during the last decades. And this is what would come out. This is what we need to avoid, because this is not only 3 to 4 degrees global warming, this is 6 degrees global warming. We need to avoid that. So how need the global energy system look like to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor? This is about low carbon development, because we need a low carbon energy system, obviously. it might look like this way. So what you can see is that the consumption of energy has been halved. No, this is the business as usual path. This is what we need. Half. So 50% of the solution is efficiency, resource efficiency. Produce the same amount of wealth, but with half of the energy which we are investing now. Energy efficiency. The second half of the solution is we need, of course, a new energy mix. From 85% fossil and 50 non-fossil, at the end of the century, it needs to be exactly the other way around. 15 still fossil and 85 non-fossil. This is why we call this process a great transformation. It's not a small incremental reorganization of systems. It is a huge step because we are going out of the fossil area, which actually started with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution in the 20s of the 18th century started with investments in fossil energy production, which speeded up our labor productivity development. So our whole Industrial Revolution process during the last 215 years is basing on high carbon energy systems. And we need to go out of that now rapidly because global warming is destroying the four fundamentals of global development. So, are we on track? Unfortunately, we are not on track. You have been reading in the newspapers that greenhouse gas emissions are still growing, are still increasing. But there is another important issue which you can see here on the graph. What you can see here is that the green things here, this is carbon efficiency. Carbon efficiency. So on the one hand side, during the last decades, carbon emissions have been growing year per year per year, but carbon efficiency at least has been improving. So with less emissions, we have been producing more. And what you can see here is that not only the carbon emissions are increasing, also carbon efficiency is now going down. So we are producing less with more emissions of greenhouse gases. What is behind this trend? Behind this trend is that the new economic powers, most of them, unfortunately all of them actually, it's about China and India, South Africa, Indonesia, they are growing, which is fine and good. They are reducing poverty. But those economies are very strongly high carbon driven. Most of these countries do have cheap coal resources, which makes the transformation towards low carbon very difficult. So we are not only going too slowly into the right direction, we are actually, if you look to the carbon inefficiencies here, we are going into the wrong direction during the last decade. This is the problem. So this is what we need to change. Next step. Who are the drivers of, who need to be the drivers of a low carbon transformation? On the one hand side, which is absolutely clear, our countries, the OECD countries, we need to be the drivers of low carbon transformation processes because we have been emitting most since the Industrial Revolution. So there is no solution without low carbon investments in OECD countries. This is for sure, absolutely. But then we do have a second trend. The second trend in the global economy is we are confronted and moving through radical, I call them tectonic, power shifts in the global economy. What you can see here is on the left-hand side a comparison between the G7 countries and the E7 countries. This is from the World Bank and Pricewaterhouse. So G7 countries are the most important and biggest OECD countries, which met several days ago in France. And the E7 countries, the emerging seven, these are China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Turkey, Mexico, and Russia. And what you can see here in 2006 or 7, the aggregated national product of the G7 countries is still 3 times higher than the national product of the emerging 7. So from the perspective of OECD countries, one might relax a little bit. If you go to the middle, you can see the same thing calculated in purchase parities. So the value of the money in the defined country. Then you can see that still the G7 countries are much more important in economic aggregated terms than the E7 countries. And then have a look to the right-hand side here, this is 2050. Our OECD economy is calculated with an annual growth around 1 to 2%, and the emerging 7 countries calculated with different growth scenarios between 3 to 7%, conservative actually. And what you get out of it is this. And what you can see here is that in the middle of this century, the global economy will look like very, very differently. Very differently. So this is the shift to the east. This is a shift to the new emerging economies. And this implies that without these countries, there is no solution at all. No solution at all. This is why it is so important that the European Union gets engaged with these countries. If we don't find allies here, there is no solution for global warming, and there is no transformation towards low-carbon global economy. This is something similar from a different perspective. Now, not from the perspective of countries and economies, but from the perspective of middle classes. So middle classes are people which are earning more than $8,000 per year. This is us in the OECD countries in the past. In 1990, 75% of the global middle classes, people earning more than $8,000, these are the emitters also. We are consuming, we are emitting, we are driving the high carbon economy. So 75% of the global middle income countries in 1990, after the end of the Cold War, have been living in OECD countries, 75%. Here you can see that in 2009, this year, only 50% of the global middle classes are living in the OECD countries. And in 2030, only 20% of the global middle classes might live in industrialized countries, and the rest of the global middle classes might live in different countries. They are living in this calculation in Asia. So again, if you would like to make the low carbon transformation without new alliances with these countries and these people, there is no solution. This is very important. My last point regarding changes in the global economy and arguing for making new alliances, and this is now about development cooperation in a more narrow sense. What you can see here interestingly is that, for me interestingly, now in the second part of the crisis or the end of the crisis, many poor countries are growing, and not only the emerging economies, not only China and India and Brazil. Many poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa are growing much faster than developed countries. The blue countries here are growing with more than 5%, above 5%. And these light blue here, this is between 3 and 5%. So Russia, for example. The important thing is that, fortunately, now, also many developing countries are growing. This is good news for poverty reduction. And regarding low carbon, it is so important that now, in these countries, we are not repeating the same mistakes. Because in these countries, we will see heavy investments in energy production. This needs to be low carbon. So if we would like to go for low carbon, it needs to be done in OECD countries, in emerging economies, and in very poor countries. We need to have this in mind. And at the end of the day, currently we stay in the global economy with around 35 countries which do not have any chance to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. 35. 1 billion people living there. From these 35 countries, 24 are conflict countries, war countries, fragile states, failing states. So at the beginning of this century, poverty issues, hard poverty issues, are matched with security dimensions. Okay, so low carbon is needed not only in OECD countries, but it's also needed in emerging economies and even in poor countries. If we really would like to go for 2 degrees Celsius, at the end of the first half of the century, this century, in 2050, what would be allowed per capita, per person on Earth, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, is something between 1 ton and 1.5 tons. Currently, 120 countries around the world are emitting more. 120. So many countries need to go as rapidly as possible towards low carbon. This needs to be an imperative for development cooperation. So there is no room for high carbon development, not even in poor countries. This is the message here. Okay, so then the great transformation. So we need to go for low carbon. This was my plaidoyer for low carbon. Now the question is how to do that. And we started thinking about that, looking for analogies in history. And what we found is that from our perspective, this transformation of the global economy, the 85% fossil and only 50% non-fossil global economy, towards something exactly around, the other way around, the only two analogies which we found are the Neolithic revolution. So this is 10,000 years ago, more or less, when people started to organize agriculture. We became farmers as humanity, and we started to organize ourselves in small villages. And what we call modern civilization is what the Neolithic revolution is about. So a huge shift. In these times, only 1 million people lived on Earth. 1 million people. So the next big shift in human civilization, this was, from our perspective, the Industrial Revolution. 1 billion people lived on Earth when the Industrial Revolution started. This was the fossil revolution, which we put forward. And now what we need, the present transformation is, it needs to be low carbon, it needs to be sustainable, it needs to be within the planetary boundaries. Because what the natural scientists are demonstrating us is that we are touching several planetary boundaries. And we need to organize an economy within these planetary boundaries for 9 billion people in 2050. This is the challenge. And we call this, therefore, the great transformation. We copied this term, the great transformation, from an economist from Hungary. Some of you might know him. It's Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi wrote a very important and very famous book, actually, decades ago, in the 30s of the last century, about the great transformation. And what he had in mind is, his argument is that global capitalism, the market economy, which is fast and drives innovation, but at the same time produces crises and produces social inequalities. The only way to stabilize market economies was matching it with democracy. So his great transformation was market economy bringing together with democracy, making market economy stable. The only way to do that. This is his formula. And we use the same term here, arguing that the only way to stabilize the global economy, middle term and long term, is making it low carbon, making it and organizing it within the planetary boundaries. So this is the next great transformation, within the planetary boundaries and very, very low carbon. This is what we need to push forward. So this is the way we reflect on this transformation path, to say so. From our perspective, this is not a linear process. It's not. We argue that we do have a pre-phase here. This is the low-carbon economy. This is where we have to go. This is where we are in several countries in different stages. It is difficult to climb this ladder up for different reasons, which I will come back to. And if you climb this ladder up, I would say Europe is here. China is also here. The US is still here. So in the pre-phase, we are trying to make the low-carbon transformation real. But there are many lock-in perspectives. So we improve energy efficiency, but build even bigger houses. So we make our cars more fuel efficient, but our cars are becoming much bigger and we buy even more cars. This is what rebound effects and lock-in effects are about. So we are becoming more efficient, but growing in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to avoid this path dependency and rebound effects. These are very strong. This is our 3 to 4 degrees path, which we are on. We need to climb this ladder up. So how to do that? We argue in our report that actually we are optimistic. We are more optimistic now than 20 years ago, for example. The Rio conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, the first big conference on environment and development. We are more optimistic now because the situations on several levels, on 3 levels, has been changing. And I will go through these 3 levels to argue that now there is a window of opportunity to make the transformation. The conditions are actually there. Let's start here on the bottom. Let's start in the middle actually. So this is our high carbon regime, our high carbon global economy. It's about technology, it's about politics, it's about the industry sectors, it's about science, it's about culture. So the high carbon economy is a system. Everything in our society is oriented toward this system. Our whole economy is organized around the high growth high carbon pattern. This is the argument here. So if this high carbon regime is completely stable, there are very little chances to change. The argument is that when Chernobyl occurred in '86, we had no renewable energy systems. We did not have the technologies to make a transformation towards renewable energies. Now we do have these energy systems. We know how to do it. We do have systems which already work. Our argument is that the high carbon system here is already in process of transformation. If you look towards the European emission trading system, this is already a very strong instrument. I would like to have it even stronger, but it is a very important instrument towards low carbon. If you look into our industries, in Germany, 25% of our workers are already working in environmentally efficiency sectors. So these are strong economic actors also. So the high carbon system is not stable anymore. This is a good situation, because this is also about lobby structures and power structures. So there is already transformation. The second point here, the second level is the base, let's say the basic levels. We call this the low carbon pioneers. So we do have the IPCC. We do have our renewable energy industries and firms. We do have politicians in each parties, in every party in Europe, thinking about these kind of low carbon transformation processes. It is not any longer something between the right and the left, or conservatives between social democrats or something. In every and each party there are these kind of low carbon thinkers already. So many people are preparing for this kind of low carbon transformation. This is our perception. And we bring into this report, we bring data in. So which kind of actors do we have in mind there? And we bring data for that. So our argument is that as the high carbon regime is already in transformation towards something more green, and we do have many pioneers here pressing on working for the transformation, there is a chance to change. In '91 or in '92, the Rio conference, sustainable development was a niche issue. This was a big conference, but nobody in the industries, the private sector really believed in sustainable development. This was a minority issue. This is different today. I do not know any important firm where green transformation isn't an important issue in terms of new waves of innovation. So these kind of things are changing. These are our 2 levels which we found as important, arguing that in '92 the chances to really transform this system towards low carbon was minor, very small, because the pioneers have been few and the system has been very stable still. But this is different now. So we see a chance to make this transformation. Sorry for having it only in German here, but I'm going to explain it, of course, in English. We are still translating the whole issue. It's new, it's fresh material here. What I would like to tell you here is that we did not only look at the win-win constellations, because we need to talk about the problems also. So what I'm going to talk about now very briefly is the 5 very good news. So factors which are pushing towards the low carbon transformation, and the 5 most important challenges and difficulties. We need to know the difficulties also in order to be realistic and develop realistic proposals. So where are the 5 good news and where are the 5 bad news? Let's start to be relaxed and to be optimistic and to develop an optimistic mode. Let's start with the 5 optimistic and positive factors. So what is there on the positive side? The first point is something which I already mentioned. We see a huge autodynamic in terms of technological development. In the industrial sectors, in the energy sectors, in many sectors, we do have a technological boost towards environmental efficiency and low carbon efficiency. Uncomparable with any decade during the last century, to say so. So the technologies are actually there. The technologies are already there. If the answer would be we haven't technologies to go out of high carbon, there wouldn't be any solution. We argue that the technologies are there, and we need how much we have to invest to make them even more competitive or competitive. So the technology is there. The second point is we can finance that. I will come back to this point. We can finance that. The most important data here is that we have to finance more or less 1 to 2% of the global national product into low carbon investments to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor. This is not little money. It's not only a few dollars. It's huge money. But 1 to 2% is possible to finance. And the second important data is that if you compare the investments in the energy sector, which is the most important sector, which we need to invest anyway, and we would go for business as usual for 9 billion people, and then compare these investments with investments in a 15 to 85 global energy system, so going for low carbon. If you look on the whole investment cycle from now to 2040, 2050, the costs for both systems are very comparable. They are very similar. In some scenarios, we go cheaper if we go for renewable energies. So over the whole investment cycle, it is comparable or even cheaper. But the important data is that the investments, the upfront investments which we need, are going to be higher. And I'm going to talk about this, the volume which is important here. This is similar with the situation in the nuclear industry in the 70s. We went for nuclear, although it has been more costly at the beginning. The argument was that in the future it will be very cheap. With the renewables, it's absolutely similar. The upfront investments are higher than going for high carbon, but on the longer run, it will be cheaper anyway. So we do have also the instruments to organize that. This is not something which we can't solve. So the third point is, we do have the technologies, we can finance that. We observe internationally that let's call it green consciousness. So the consciousness that the planetary boundaries are not fake, are not something of green idealists. That this is about the economy and the fundamentals of development. Most people understand this now. We do have data from business people from around the world, very different sectors, and if you go for interviews with them, of course they are defending their interests in terms of their own companies, but they understand that this kind of challenges, this is real. And not only firm managers understand this, many people also understand this. This is very different with the situation 20 years ago. We do have data which demonstrate that. So the legitimacy for political decision makers to move forward is now there. It hasn't been there 20 years ago. This is important because we need political legitimacy for this kind of transformation, of course. The fourth point is that the global knowledge networks which we have now make this transformation much easier than it has been 20 years ago. So the diffusion of knowledge, of innovation, of know-how is easier now than any time before. And our fifth point here is that there are many positive factors if we make this low-carbon transformation beyond the climate issue, which are important for our societies. It is about health. It is about job creation. It is about decentralizing our energy systems. It is about becoming less dependent from difficult oil exporters around the world. There are several factors which are very interesting from this kind of societal perspective, which go beyond the pure climate argumentation, which is important. So, 5 nice factors. But we also have 5 difficult factors. Which are the 5 difficult factors? The first difficult factor is that is about path dependency. Path dependency. This is the lock-in issue. Our industries and economies are still dominated, although we do have these green and environmental industries now, all still dominated by high carbon sectors. So changing their mind and changing the infrastructures behind is a very difficult task, as you all know. It's about power. One of our chapters is called "It's About Politics, Stupid." You might remember Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton said during his presidency, "It's about the economy, stupid." And we say it's about politics, stupid. This path dependency has to do with political interest structures. We need to know that. But it's not only about interest structures. I think it is about all of us, because we all have mental maps which are shaped by high carbon thinking, because this is what development has been about during the last 250 years. When I go to Africa, very often decision makers there tell me, "You would like to sell me solar energy and windmills? This is not high technology. We would like to go for nuclear, for coal, for gas, modern, big, you know." So this is about mental maps, path dependency. John Maynard Keynes had a very interesting sentence. He said that it is very easy actually to develop new concepts and ideas. The really difficult thing is to forget the old ones. To forget the old ones. This is about changing mental maps. It's about different mindsets. It's about imagining how low carbon can really work. So, path dependency. The second issue is something which I already mentioned. The time frame is difficult. I showed you that we need to peak before 2020 globally. So we are under high time pressure. This makes me absolutely nervous. The technology is there, we can finance that, but the time pressure is there. And as Barbara said, currently decision makers are oriented towards other issues, which seems to be more pressing. The third issue here is that it's about a global process, so we need global cooperation for that. I argue that this is not only for the European Union, it's not only for OECD countries. We need to bring in emerging economies and even low-income countries into this process. So global cooperation is absolutely basic to make this kind of thing happen. And it will become cheaper if we bring together many economies to move into this direction. So global cooperation. You all know that currently global cooperation is not at all easy. Many of our multilateral processes are stagnating. The World Trade Organization, the climate process, wherever you look, we do not have drivers of multilateral cooperation processes currently. So this is the third point which makes it difficult. The fourth point is that, I will come back to this point in a minute, it's urbanization. The fourth point is urbanization. This is a headache for me. Energy is easy, urbanization is difficult. So why urbanization? Urbanization is important because 70% of the energy-related greenhouse gases are coming from our cities. 70%. And what's happening now? We are in a global urbanization revolution or big shift. Currently, 3 billion people on Earth, 3.3 actually, are living in cities. 50% of the global population is living in cities now. We reached this point last year, several months ago. So in 2050, we will have 6.3 billion people living in cities. 70% of the global population. Doubling of the urban population. In Asia, it's even faster. In Asia, it's about 1.5 billion people living in urban areas today. In 2030, we will have 3 billion people living in urban areas in Asia. Within 2 decades, doubling the urban population from 1.5 to 3 billion people. So what's about that? Why is this so important? 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from cities. So if we go for business as usual in our cities, in the development of our cities, we do have no chance at all to make the low carbon transformation possible. No chance at all. To get a feeling for that, what is 1.5 to 3 billion people in urban areas in Asia? This is factor 2.5 to 4, different scenarios and different calculations, of the urban infrastructure, which is being built now in Asia during the next 2 decades, which we have been building in Europe since the Industrial Revolution, the 2 world wars included. So this is what is happening now in Asia in the next 20 years. And this needs to be as low carbon as possible. This is about international cooperation. We need to invest to make urbanization worldwide low carbon. If not, no way out. This is about Asia, but it's also about Africa, where urban areas are growing. It's about Latin America. We need investments in these areas. And currently, as you know, we do not have even one really low-carbon city on Earth. Not even one. So this is a headache. And the fifth point here is cheap coal in the fastest-growing economies on Earth. China, India, South Africa, Indonesia, the emerging 6 or 7. So these are my headaches. Okay, so how much time do I have? 10 minutes. Okay, that's fine. So let's go through let's go to the cost structures and what we need to change. I will skip this slide. And before I talk about the cost structures, what we argue for is, and we borrowed this by Jacques Rousseau actually, we argue for a social contract. This kind of transformation is far-reaching. And we argue in our report here that we need to convince our population also. We do have a huge debate on this in Germany currently. New energy systems, how, costs, what does this imply for our urban areas, for our mobility institutions and structures and so on. So legitimacy for this kind of shift is very important. We argue for social contracts, no? For trying to convince people to go into this direction. Legitimacy is very, very important. So the 3 areas which we need to change, and I already mentioned 2, at the end of the day, these ones. When we go for low carbon, any sector is important, any industrial sector. But the 3 major sectors which we need to focus on are energy, this is for sure, and I also already argued for energy and why energy is so important. This is the first thing. The second thing is then land use, because 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from land use changes. This is about protecting the forests on the one hand side and developing low carbon agricultural policies on the other hand side. So development policy here is also very important. Low carbon agriculture is relevant. We still do not have the concepts here, and we still do not have consensus here. In the energy sector, something like a consensus is emerging. In the agricultural sector, there isn't. This is the second sector, land use change. And the third sector is what I already talked about, urbanization. And I talked about the dimensions. So we have to change these very important basic structures of the global economy during the next decades. Energy, land use, and urbanization. Now the costs. What does this cost? Because any political decision maker and any manager of any firm will ask you, what is this in terms of monies and dollars around? And I do have 2 or 3 slides for that. The first thing is this here. These are different long-term cost scenarios. And what you can see is that the calculations come up with data in terms of how much is this more expensive than business as usual investments. And they come up with 0.7% of the global GDP up to 4%, even 5 here, 5%. In terms of incremental costs, 5% is absolutely unrealistic because they don't calculate technological innovation in, so technological learning curves. Most of the data here are around 1% to 2.5%. So is this much, is this little? How to compare? And I would like to compare this with 2 other things. The first one is that currently, incredibly, we are investing between $400 to $850 billion annually in fossil fuel production. Can you imagine that? We are talking about dangerous climate change and avoiding it, but in the global economy, we are investing between $400 to $800 and something dollars subsidies, public money for fossil fuel production. So this is 1.7 to 1.5% of the global national product. If we go out of that and go in with this money into the renewable or low carbon sectors, the story will look like very different. So this is one important data. Let's invest the subsidies for high carbon in low carbon. The second important data is that, of course, in these calculations, the impacts of climate change, and therefore also the costs which dangerous climate change implies. We have seen the water issues and the land issues and so on, sea level rise and other things, are not factored in. So if we have these two data in mind, the existing subsidies for high fossil and going for low carbon, we are avoiding costs in terms of avoiding impacts of climate change. This is neutral or even a very good business. But we need to think mid and long term, of course. This is the German case. For the German case, we calculated the energy consumption prices if we go radically for low carbon, which our government actually decided on yesterday night. No, we will go out of nuclear, and we are going for 30 to 40% reduction of greenhouse gases towards 2020. It is ambitious. It could be even more ambitious, but it is ambitious. And here you can see what this is costing us. So these are our national energy consumption prices altogether. We are paying altogether in Germany 220 billion euros for energy. What you can see here is this, that if we go radically for low carbon, these are the incremental costs. So this is what low carbon is going to cost us during the next decade. And what you can see here is that our prices, what we need to pay for energy is going up by 10% during the next decade, 10%. And then it is going down radically beyond 2020, after a decade. Because we do not need to feed energy systems anymore. No, we have to feed our our coal plants with coal, our gas plants with gas, whatever we need to feed. If you go for wind turbines and solar energy, this kind of feed investments are not any longer needed. So what is coming out is that we need to accept 10% higher prices, on average of course, during the next decade, and then prices are going down. So this is what we have to talk about. And this is what currently also in Europe are the data which we do have on our tables. So there are 6 conditions, and I'm coming to the end. From a European perspective, there are 6 conditions to make the transformation possible and financially viable. The first thing is that we have to accept that the upfront costs are going to be higher. We are saying in calculating 10%. But we need to know that over the whole investment cycle, the costs are similar to business as usual or even cheaper. This is an important data. We need to communicate this. Now, if you listen to coal power plant managers, they are talking about the end of national industries. This will not be the case. Second point, we need to consider when we calculate costs, the long-term costs of climate damages. If we don't do this, this is not serious. Because we can calculate the damages which we will see with dangerous global warming. Third point here. I said already that 50% of the solution is energy efficiency. We also calculated the costs linked with energy efficiency issues. And we come out with the data. We argue, and we calculated the costs around this data. We argue that we should limit global energy consumption between 350 to 400 exajoules globally. Currently, we are consuming around 330 exajoules globally. So we should organize a cap for energy consumption. And the only way to do this is energy efficiency. If we are not good in energy efficiency, the low carbon transformation will become more expensive. Fourth point here, if we would make the transformation towards low carbon in Europe as a whole, the European Union, the costs would be 30% lower than going alone nationally. Because this is about bringing the best energy resources from around the continent together in a European energy system, a renewable energy system. So it's about sun in the south, it's about wind at our coasts. We need new grids for that. We might bring in North Africa. So going European is 30% cheaper. Very important point. Fifth point here, from now on, if we go for low carbon within the 2 degrees Celsius corridor, 70 to 80% of our investments need to be non-fossil in the energy sector. The rest is still carbon oriented. So there is a margin for the transformation. We still have several investments in carbon energy patterns. And the last point here is that I think that the competition and cooperation between China and Europe is key here. We don't go alone for low carbon. This is good news because the US guys are telling us that if you go for low carbon, you will lose your competitiveness. This is why we don't go for low carbon. I think this calculation is absolutely wrong because the Chinese are going for low carbon now. And if the Chinese are going for low carbon, this is a huge competition for who will be the next in this green wave of innovation. This helps us to go towards low carbon. And at the same time, it's not only about competition, it's also about cooperation. We suggested to our government and to the European Union in this report and in several other debates before in Brussels, we suggested to invest with Chinese partners in renewable energy, research, in qualification and education of the next generation of low-carbon engineers in any sector, and in low-carbon urbanization, to demonstrate to the rest of the global economy that these two regions and countries are going for low carbon. I'm sure that if we would be able to do that, even bringing Brazil into this alliance, the rest of the world then need to decide, do we really think that high carbon is the future of the global economy? So organizing tipping points. This is my argument here. Coming to the end, last slide, 2 slides which I would like to show is actually for Terry. It's about climate justice. So finishing with climate justice. Let's go for climate justice. Okay. So I argued that we do have 750 gigatons greenhouse gases from now on to 2050, which is compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius target with avoiding dangerous climate change. So the question in Copenhagen, this is Copenhagen, this photo here is Copenhagen, last night. In Copenhagen, the discussion was, and then again in Cancun, and now in South Africa at the end of the year, the discussion actually is how organized burden sharing, having in front of us globally these 750 gigatons. So who needs to bring down greenhouse gas emissions at which speed? And there is no consensus. And what we are doing is we are negotiating country per country per country per country. It's not working. The US are saying that the Chinese don't do. The Chinese are arguing the OECD is emitting since 1920. So from country to country, this is not working. We did a study for our government in 2009. They asked us the following question: how would an ideal global climate regime, this is obviously a cornerstone of a low-carbon global economy, look like? It needs to be plausible, not too difficult, not too many factors. This was the fear that scientists like to bring in many factors in. So plausible and easy. Fair, because there is no solution beyond fairness. We need to bring the developing countries in. And also economically towards efficiency gains. So how to do this? 750 gigatons. And the solution we came up with is carbon justice, actually. The efficiency formula the fairness and efficiency formula we came up with is this. So for those of you who like mathematics or economics, this is our formula. What we did is, I'm coming up with, it's only about 4 factors. I will come up with the 4 factors. We calculated with 4 parameters, I will show you the 4 parameters, national budgets for each and every national economy on Earth. The idea is that we do have 750 gigatons. We need a burden sharing formula so that at the end of this negotiation, every country then has a national greenhouse gas budget, and then we start emission trading. Because this is efficiency oriented. For high carbon emitters, us, for example, in Germany, this would imply that if we are more efficient, we need to buy less carbon certificates. This is a push for carbon efficiency. For low carbon emitters, it's also an incentive to be even more efficient or even less carbon emitters because they can sell their certificates. So this is the idea, and this is the formula, and I will go into the 4 parameters, which are completely easy actually. So these are the 4 parameters which we suggest. We say the first parameter is 2 degrees, a consensus on that is needed, and we do have already this consensus since Cancun. And we need to link the 2 degrees Celsius with the probability to reach the goal. We argue for 67% and come up with 750 gigatons. If the global community would say we need to be higher risk-oriented, 50%, the budget will be a bit bigger. So we need consensus on that. This is the first parameter. We can negotiate that. The suggestion is negotiate these 4 parameters, not country per country per country. We have 195 countries on Earth. So the second issue is then historical responsibility. This is very important in the debate with developing countries, because developing countries with very good arguments are arguing that you as OECD countries started already 200 years ago to emit. So you produced the problem. We need to bring historical responsibility in. This is obviously right. Even in the discussions with China, China is growing rapidly. It's growing also in emissions. But China started to emit 20 years ago. It was a very low emitter during the last 200 years or so. So it is about historical responsibility. Our suggestion is to start to factor the emissions, the historical emissions in, beginning in 1990. Here we do have a conflict, for example, with our Indian friends. Our Indian climate advisors are arguing for bringing historic responsibilities in starting in 1840 with the Industrial Revolution. We argue for 1990 for 2 reasons. The first reason is that in 1990 the first big IPCC report came out. So in 1990 for the first time scientifically argued we could say that climate change is with a very high probability human driven and it is dangerous. So in 1990 we knew that. Before we didn't know that. The argument is if you don't know something you can't be responsible for that. This is the first argument. The second argument is in 92 in Rio all heads of state accepted that climate change is a global threat. So we do have a global consensus starting in 1990. So we calculated historical responsibility in 1990. Third criteria, this is the real hard fact justice criteria. We think and argue that there is only one acceptable, globally acceptable, robust fairness criteria, and this is equal emission per capita worldwide. Because no one in developing countries will accept that Irish people and UK guys and Germans are allowed to emit 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 20 times, even 100 times more. This is the relation between many sub-Saharan countries and us. So equal per capita. And then the fourth issue is global population growth. So if the population is becoming bigger, the per capita emission budget is becoming smaller. How to factor this in? We argue for working with the current data to have an incentive to less global population growth. This is difficult. We need to negotiate that. If we do this, and this is now my last slide, what is coming out is that. Have a look on the last column here. What we calculated here are the national budgets for different countries and how long these budgets, these national budgets, would last based on this formula. And what you can see is that our German budget would last for 10 years, towards 2020 or something. The US budget would last for 6 years. The Chinese for 24 years. China also needs to buy certificates very rapidly. And for the really poor countries, of course, they do have much more space, and they are those who are selling certificates. And what we will see then is efficiency gains on both sides, high emitters, low emitters, and a financial flow towards low-emitting countries. And this is what we need. We need that developing countries are going for low carbon and have the chance to build climate-friendly economies. And we think that this might be the formula to solve the global climate justice problem. So these has been some of the elements which we perceive as most relevant for the low-carbon transformation. Thank you very much for your patience.